Yanga, the stolen prince who fought an empire. The spirit of resistance seeded before slavery even began. We begin not in the Americas, but in the heart of Central Africa, among the people of the Bran, or possibly Yoruba/Congo lineage. In a time before chains, before plantations, there are kingdoms, and among these, one young prince was being groomed in the wisdom of his ancestors. His people understood not only the politics of the land, but the spirits of the forests, the language of the ancestors, and the balance between power and humility. That young prince, Gaspar Yanga, lived under the authority of elders who believed in the sacredness of life. But the winds from across the sea were changing. Portuguese and Spanish ships had begun sweeping along the West African coast like wolves backed by greed, sugar, and conquest. Villages were raided, kings betrayed, warriors bound. Yanga was stolen, not as a common captive, but as a symbol of a deeper robbery, the kidnapping of sovereignty itself. When Yanga was chained and shipped across the Atlantic, he wasn't alone. Millions of African souls were being torn from their land. Yoruba, Mandinka, Fon, Congo, each with their gods, kings, and dreams. The transatlantic slave trade was not just physical brutality. It was a spiritual assault. It attempted to erase names, break memory, and crush spirit. But in the belly of those ships, prayers were whispered. Even with blood-stained decks and sickness, the ancestral fire stayed alive. Yanga's journey from prince to property was brutal. Shackled beside strangers, renamed and resold in New Spain, modern-day Mexico, he was dumped into the sugarcane fields where Africans labored under the lash from sunrise to sunset. But every swing of the machete carried the rhythm of the old drums. He remembered. They called him Gaspar, but his African name was never lost, only hidden, guarded like a relic inside his chest. Even as sweat and pain marked each day, Yanga watched. He studied. He remembered how his forefathers walked with a sword in one hand and the orisha in the other. He began to connect with other enslaved Africans. Secret languages were shared in nighttime whispers. Plans brewed. The mountains beyond Veracruz weren't just a rain. They were destiny. Freedom would not be begged for. It would be reclaimed. Yanga had lost his kingdom, but the spirit of a king burned in his veins. In that moment, Yanga made a choice that would change history. He would not die as property. He would not pass his name into silence. He would escape, and not just to live, but to lead. In 1570, he vanished into the mountains, along with a small band of warriors. They called it running, but he called it rising. What began as survival soon became strategy. Yanga wasn't hiding. He was building. The jungle became his fortress, and freedom became his creed. In the shadows of empire, the spirit of Africa began to roar once more. Kindly smash the subscribe button. Do well to like and on the notification button for the latest historical update. High in the rugged hills of Veracruz, where the Spanish dared not settle, Gaspar Yanga forged a new kind of kingdom, one not bound by gold or throne, but by fire, freedom, and ancestral will. With nothing but courage, jungle knowledge, and iron will, Yanga and his comrades built a maroon settlement. What the Spanish called a palenque. These settlements weren't just hideouts, they were defiant new worlds. Here, African spiritual traditions were rekindled. Drums echoed again. Griots recited oral stories, and rituals honored the deities who had journeyed with them through chains and blood. In the heart of captivity, Africa had carved a space of memory and rebellion. Yanga, the prince-turned-fugitive, became a leader not by title, but by trust. Around him gathered men and women from many tribes, bound not by ethnicity, but by resistance. He wasn't just leading a group, he was reuniting a scattered nation. The mountains were unforgiving, but so were the people who now called them home. Life was harsh. No fertile farmland, no roads, no wealth. Only trees, rocks, and the knowledge that the enemy waited below. Yet, Yanga's warriors trained like ghost soldiers, experts in terrain, speed, and stealth. They became a whisper among Spanish colonists, a terror to slavers. By day, they vanished into the jungle. By night, they struck, ambushing roads, freeing enslaved people, and seizing supplies. Each raid brought more weapons, more recruits, and more reason for the Spanish to fear. The colonial authorities tried to label them bandits, but Yanga's forces were organized, disciplined, and driven by something deeper: the ancestral command to liberate themselves. The Palenque had grown into a symbol, not just a safe haven, but the first seat of African self-rule in the New World. For over 3 decades, the Spanish tried and failed to crush Yanga's rebellion. Expeditions were sent to find him, but they often returned broken, or didn't return at all. The Maroons knew every path, every rock, every hiding spot. They moved like spirit messengers, impossible to catch. Slavery was a law of the land, but Yanga's mountains lived by a different law, one older than Europe's empires: the right of a free soul to choose its destiny. And in these mountains, Africans and indigenous allies learned to trust one another. Intermarriages happened, cultures blended. They shared herbs, weapons, and war songs. What was once a scattered people became a confederation, a society without chains. And Yanga, without a golden crown or kingdom halls, ruled like a king in exile, commanding with the wisdom of his ancestors and the fire of freedom. But freedom couldn't stay hidden forever. By the early 1600s, Yanga's rebellion had grown too powerful to ignore. Spanish colonial forces saw him not just as a nuisance, but a threat to the entire slave system. If one maroon colony could survive, more could rise. In 1609, Spain launched a full-scale military campaign to destroy Yanga's village. The battle was brutal. Outnumbered and outgunned, Yanga's forces fought with every ounce of spirit they had. Women, elders, and children defended their land alongside warriors. The Spanish burned homes, but they couldn't burn the will of the people. The fight reached a bloody stalemate, and Yanga, ever wise, understood the moment. He didn't surrender. He made a move that would change history again. He sent a proposal to the Spanish: negotiate peace or face endless resistance. Kindly smash the subscribe button, do well to like, and on the notification button for the latest historical update. In the heat of war, when most leaders would bend or break, Gaspar Yanga did neither. His offer to the Spanish was not a plea, it was a challenge. After nearly 40 years of rebellion, he knew one truth: Spain could burn his village to ash, but it would never extinguish the idea it had sparked. Yanga proposed a ceasefire. In return, he demanded the unthinkable for his time: recognition of a free black town, freedom for all who had escaped slavery and joined him, and self-governance without Spanish interference. To colonial ears, it was audacity. To Yanga, it was justice. His terms weren't just military, they were spiritual. He didn't ask to be accepted. He declared what was already true: we are free. Behind that proposal stood not only warriors but women, elders, and children, generations who had risked everything to live outside bondage. The Spanish crown was shocked, but they were also exhausted. For Spain, the war against Yanga had become a bottomless pit, draining soldiers, resources, and credibility. The tropical terrain favored Yanga's guerrilla fighters. Each skirmish cost more than it won. Morale was breaking, and the fear of Yanga's resistance spreading to other enslaved Africans was very real. The colony could not afford a movement. So, in a rare act of colonial pragmatism, the Spanish sat at the table. In 1618, after 9 years of negotiation and resistance, Gaspar Yanga emerged from the mountains, not as a rebel in hiding, but as a diplomat of a new world. The treaty was signed, and San Lorenzo de los Negros was officially recognized, the first free black town in the Americas. The Spanish agreed to leave the Maroons in peace. Yanga had not only fought the empire to a standstill, he had reversed slavery's script. His rebellion forced the oppressors to legitimize the freedom they once tried to destroy. San Lorenzo was not a utopia. It was poor, isolated, and constantly under watch. But it was sovereign. It had elders, spiritual leaders, its own militia, and a council that governed in the spirit of African customs blended with new realities. Yanga served as the town's founding leader, not as a king, but as a father to the people. His legacy was carved not in monuments, but in the daily act of black self-rule, a revolutionary idea in a time when African lives were seen only as property. The very existence of the town challenged the entire system of slavery. It reminded the world that Africans were not passive victims, but thinkers, strategists, and nation builders. In a time when European maps erased African agency, Yanga drew his own borders with courage, sacrifice, and memory. No white crown gave him legitimacy. His authority came from his people and his resistance. Word of Yanga spread slowly across mountains and plantations, whispered in sugarcane fields and carried in prayers. Though many colonists would try to erase or distort his story, the truth remained. Yanga had accomplished the impossible. He had escaped, resisted, negotiated, and founded. He hadn't just freed himself. He made freedom a law. This wasn't a lone act of rebellion. It was a flowering of an African tradition that long resisted tyranny, from the warrior queens of Dahomey to the marabouts of Sahel. Yanga's story belongs not just in Mexico or Africa, but to all who fight oppression. The negotiation of fire wasn't about surrender. It was about turning pain into policy, rage into law, and memory into legacy. Yanga proved that even in the age of empires, a stolen man could become a nation, and the mountain where he stood was no longer a refuge. It had become a throne. Kindly smash the subscribe button. Do well to like and on the notification button for the latest historical update. San Lorenzo de los Negros stood as proof that history could be bent, but not broken. Yet, like so many stories of African triumph, Gaspar Yanga's legacy was slowly buried beneath the silence of colonial record-keeping. There were no statues raised in his honor. No songs echoed his name in city plazas. Official Spanish accounts referred to the treaty, but downplayed the man behind it. The liberated town he founded remained on the margins of national memory. For centuries, Yanga became a ghost in the archives, a whisper, a shadow. But among the descendants of those he freed, his name survived. It lived in oral stories passed from grandmother to grandson, in rituals honoring the ancestors, and in the quiet knowledge that somewhere in these hills, a man had once stood up and won. Yanga's crown wasn't gold. It was carved in courage, and like many African kings, it was meant not for display, but for legacy. Colonial systems across the Americas worked hard to suppress black resistance stories. They feared what truth could ignite. They told tales of African docility, painted slaves as passive, grateful, or too broken to rise. But Yanga shattered that myth, and he was not alone. Across the Atlantic world, similar flames burned. The warrior priestess Nanny of the Maroons in Jamaica, Queen Zinga in Angola, Toussaint Louverture in Haiti. They all shared a spiritual lineage, a resistance that wasn't just about fighting armies, but about defying erasure. Yanga's story is proof that wherever Africans were enslaved, they also organized, rebelled, and remembered. He stood not only against physical chains, but against the slow death of identity. His victory was spiritual warfare, preserving name, dignity, and sovereignty in a world that tried to erase them all. When we remember him today, we're not just telling history. We are restoring a memory system stolen by conquest. It wasn't until 1932, over 300 years after the treaty, that the Mexican government officially honored Yanga by renaming his town simply Yanga. It was a small gesture, but a powerful one. A man they once branded a criminal had now become a national hero. And yet, even today, his name remains absent from most classrooms, both in Mexico and around the world. But now, with every generation that tells a story, the veil of silence is lifted. Yanga's spirit returns, not as folklore, but as evidence. Evidence that Africans were not just enslaved. They were engineers of freedom, authors of rebellion, and builders of new societies. The fight for that truth continues in documentaries, songs, classrooms, and even animation like this. Because to remember Yanga is to reclaim our right to narrate ourselves, not as shadows of European history, but as stars of our own. And so the story ends not in death, but in awakening. Yanga did not die in those hills. He became part of them, part of the air breathed by rebels, the trees that once hid him, and the rivers that carried his message. He lives in every cry for justice, every child named after an ancestor, every voice that dares to say, we were never just slaves. We were survivors, strategists, and sovereigns. Yanga's forgotten crown is no longer lost. We wear it when we speak truth. We polish it with every act of remembrance, and we pass it down not as a relic, but as a weapon against silence, a weapon against shame. From the mountains of Veracruz to the continent of Africa, from the plantations to people, Gaspar Yanga's spirit walks again, not barefoot, not broken, but bold, proud, and finally remembered. Kindly smash the subscribe button, do well to like, and on the notification button for the latest historical update.